As the 2025-2026 season is now over 1 week old, we have seen the average number of goals scored each game at 3.12 per team, which is 6.24 total goals per game. Today, let's dive into some scoring trends to predict if this scoring level will be maintained, or if it'll drop off or maybe even increase further. Let's start by comparing the first 200 games of each season in the salary cap era with all games after. I removed the shortened 2013 and 2021 seasons since they had much fewer games. Seasons start on different dates, but the 200 game mark when there have been a total of 200 games played in the league is usually around early to mid-November. For reference, in a 32-team league, there are 1,312 total games played. As you can see by the graph, in 14 out of 18 seasons, scoring was higher in the first 200 games than all games after. Not only that, but you can see by the highlighted yellow space in between the two lines that early season scoring was usually much higher. Whereas in 3 of the 4 seasons where scoring was actually higher later in the season, the difference is usually much smaller. Now of course the one exception is the massive gap in 2021 to 2022, but I'll actually spend some time talking about that season alone and why it's probably an outlier that shouldn't be taken too seriously. But in general, you can clearly see scoring was higher in those first few games. Of course, someone could accuse me of cherry-picking a random game mark, and even though I actually didn't test out other specific game cutoffs, they wouldn't be wrong. It is a bit arbitrary. So let's instead go by percentages. Let's start off by defining the early season as the first 10% of games played, and then we can compare it to the latter 90% of games. Now 10% is actually fewer than 200 games. It's usually going to be around 120 to 130 games. But as you can see by the chart, it follows similar trends. Even though having a percentage keeps all seasons proportionally consistent, it actually tells us less than the 200 game model because the sample size is smaller. So let's expand the sample size by comparing the first 25% of games to the latter 75% of games. It's pretty much more of the same, where the majority of seasons had higher scoring earlier in the season, but the overall difference each season does shrink, and that's expected when we increase the sample size of the early season. 25% of games will typically be between 300 and 350 games depending on the season. So from these first 3 graphs, we can see that scoring is generally higher at the beginning of the season. But to get more specific, we can look at the month-by-month scoring. What is super interesting is that November, which is often still considered the early season, is actually the lowest scoring month, and by a pretty significant margin. April is the highest scoring month, but that's to be expected as the games in April are usually a lot looser since teams know if they're going to be a playoff team or not, and generally don't care about the games as much. I think October being the highest scoring month is from the fact that players are rusty and getting back from their break, which likely impacts the defense more than the offense. In November, they probably tighten up a lot to overcompensate for the high scoring October before teams fall back into a natural equilibrium for the remainder of the season, which is why December until March are all in a similar range. Now we can actually get more specific than month by month when we look at day by day scoring. Each day is defined as a day where an NHL game occurs, so any days without hockey are not counted. The 2021-2022 season was the longest season at 189 days, but days 179 to 189 have a limited sample size, so the day by day scoring data will consider days 1 to 178. Now going literally day by day is actually a case of overfitting, meaning the data is so exact that it won't pick up on any general patterns and therefore isn't reliable to utilize for any future predictions. Instead, we can transform this data into 9 buckets of 20-day increments. The results are similar to month-by-month scoring, where the first 20 days of the season are the highest scoring. Ultimately though, I think the month-by-month breakdown is the best one because it's more practical and is specific without being too specific. But it is interesting to see how the 20-day increments follow a consistent pattern, where every 60 days, scoring seems to increase on average. Now, as promised, I want to take a bit of time to talk about the outlier 2021 to 2022 season. This was the only instance where scoring in later games was significantly higher, and it had such a bizarre trend where scoring literally increased every single month. This is something that probably won't happen again for a long time, barring a major coincidence, but I think the 21-22 season can be explained by COVID, and the fact that it was the first time quote-unquote normal hockey had been played in 1.5 years. Additionally, because of all the strict rules and constant lineup shifts and player call-ups, I think this had an impact on player chemistry in the early months of the season, which would in turn impact production. But as the pandemic was basically fading out by 2022, it had less of an impact in the later months of the season, and lineups were getting more settled in. This is just a theory, and the real cause could be something entirely different, or it could all just be a massive coincidence. But either way, the 2021-2022 season is an exception, not the rule, and scoring usually declines after October. From this analysis, it appears that October is generally one of the highest scoring months in the season, and then scoring completely drops off in November, and April's also thrown in there as a high scoring month. In terms of betting, these trends imply that it's bet to bet on the over in October and April, and the under in November, with a gray area for other months. However, I will say in general, I'm not a huge fan of the over-under, as I think the risk far outweighs the reward. From my experience, I have found that over-under betting is best as a long-term strategy, meaning it's more optimal to bet on the over-under on most games, whereas picking and choosing which games will be higher scoring is generally a flawed strategy. However, no matter how you decide to bet, having these season scoring trends is certainly a helpful tool. Be sure to subscribe for more informative hockey content, and visit my website slapshotbets.com to read the full article on this topic and many similar articles alike.